In this presentation, I'm going to provide 10 key points from the readings and background materials on global health and human rights. As I indicated in my announcement, this is an area of quite some passion for me, and I tried to prioritize the readings. There's a lot of complex issues and areas of research that are brought up in the readings, so I won't do justice to them all, but I hope I'll be able to give you at least a rudimentary kind of fundamental idea of what this global health and human rights area is all about. First of all, what is a human right? A human right refers to the interaction between the state or the authority over a group of people and an individual. They include basic freedoms and protections to which people are entitled simply because they are human beings. Human rights usually come in two categories. You have a freedom, you have a right to freedom from something, like freedom from torture or arbitrary detention, and then you have rights that involve freedom to something, like freedom to have free speech or to choose whatever religion you like. And basically there's considered to be three components of human rights frameworks. They're inalienable. In other words, you can't take them away from any human being for any reason. They engage states in positive obligations. This is kind of the freedom to, freedom from principle. So states have positive obligations, which means they are obligated to act in a certain way. And they have negative obligations, which means they're obligated not to act in a certain way in order to protect human rights. What are the key human rights instruments? We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, passed in 1948. This is a declaration. It's not legally binding. And in Article 25, it does say that everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family. So I consider this, and most analysts consider, that the Universal Declaration does not include the right to health. It includes the right to a standard of living, and health and well-being are used as markers of what a standard of living is. There is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was passed in 1966. And in the same year, you have the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. They cover different categories of rights, which we'll get into. They are binding documents on the countries that have approved them. So what are civil and political rights? Civil and political rights include the right to life, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, electoral rights, rights to due process, and a fair trial. Those are the key ones. Economic and social and cultural rights, on the other hand, are labor rights, the rights to an adequate standard of living, the right to health, and the right to education. So they're considered two different groups of rights. They all are human rights, but they're two different groups. And interestingly, there's different coalitions and networks and kind of protective mechanisms that have grown up around these two different groups of rights. And often civil and political rights are considered the premier rights, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Now, does the ICESCR, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, define the right to health? Yes, it does. In Article 12, it specifically refers to the right to health and includes 5 different areas, or 4 different areas: infant mortality and the stopping of stillbirths, environmental and industrial hygiene, epidemic control, and medical services. In 1966, this was pretty progressive to include all this. But in the late 1980s, 1990s, there was a General Comment 14 that was added, which widens the scope to include determinants of health, resource distribution, gender differences, and special situations, because the group of advocates around economic, social, and cultural rights felt that Article 12 had become insufficient, and the areas of health and the threats to health had evolved to such an extent that it required a special comment. They also added an optional protocol, which the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights also has, which allows for people or groups that feel that their rights are being negated and that their state or their authority is not respecting these rights, they can go directly to an international mechanism to get those rights respected. Now, how does the right to health differ from human rights-based approaches to health? This is important, and they also often get confused. The right to health is a legal requirement. There are specific entitlements, requirements, and obligations enumerated in human rights documents. So the issues that are specifically mentioned in General Comment 14 or in Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Human rights-based approaches are a set of norms or principles that are derived from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and they're relevant to the framing, implementing, and evaluating of health policies. So they're more conceptual frameworks that are based on human rights standards, but it's an approach. And some advocates have come up with the panel principles. So if you want to find out whether a service or a public health program is being delivered according to a human rights-based approach, you can evaluate it against the panel principles. Is there participation of the people concerned? Is there accountability of the state concerned? Is there non-discrimination? Is the service offered to everyone on a non-discriminatory basis? Are people empowered to demand their rights rather than passively receive them? And is there a legal recourse to claim these rights? So for instance, just briefly, if I'm providing a primary, let's say a primary healthcare service to people in an area that's been affected by an earthquake, let's say, I can provide services as the benefactor to victims of an earthquake. And in that case, I might provide very good services, but they're services that I decide which services are important. I decide who's the most vulnerable. I decide in what priority the services will be offered. I could be providing extremely good services, but that would not be a human rights-based approach. For it to be a human rights-based approach, I could not be looking at the group of people I was serving as victims. I would need to look at them as people entitled to these services because they hold rights to these services. I would need to allow people to participate in what the nature of the services were, what the quality of the services were, what priority was given to various services, how vulnerability was assessed. So all these issues would need to be taken into account to consider the set of services I was offering as being provided from a human rights-based approach. And the Essentials of Health talks about this, and the Audrey Chapman book on global health, human rights, and the challenges of neoliberal policies also talks about this to a good extent. Now, is the right to health a generally accepted concept? Chapman, in the Global Health and Human Rights book, talks about this at great length. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, when everyone was horrified at the way rights had been denied and people trampled upon, there was a lot of goodwill when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was developed. There was a lot of support for the right to health and other cultural and economic and social rights. But this kind of waned during the Cold War period. And in fact, for several reasons, over time, I would say in the 70s, 80s, and half the 90s, economic and social and cultural rights were considered really secondary rights to civil and political rights. And civil political rights were considered the premier rights: the right to assembly, the right to religion, the right to elect your officials. And in fact, there was some pushback on economic, social, and cultural rights, even from human rights activists who felt that the list of human rights was getting too long. And if we really wanted rights that were sacrosanct, they needed to be a shorter list over which, there was complete agreement that these were fundamental human rights. Also, there was conservative and kind of market-based theories that developed, and this is a large part of what Chapman's book talks about, that felt that the world or outsiders shouldn't be determining what a state had to provide its people in terms of economic and social and cultural rights or standards of living, and that this was getting much too involved and getting the state much too involved in the private sphere, and that pushing for taxes to be collected so these rights could be provided. It was just going to a place where really strict market-based conservative libertarian ideologies did not agree with. Also privatization. At a certain point, healthcare in some countries began to be increasingly privatized, and it was difficult for the state then to take responsibility for what private healthcare providers were doing and to hold them to certain standards. It's in fact not that difficult to hold private healthcare providers to certain standards, but this was something that people of certain ideologies or preferences did not feel should be done. So the right to health has been a contested area over time, and I would say it was a period in the 80s and early 90s where it was most contested. But is the right to health becoming more accepted over time? In the late 1990s and in the 2000s, this did happen. There is a greater acceptance of the right to health as well as for other economic, cultural, and social rights. In 2002, there was a special rapporteur on the right to health appointed by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who began to do some very some extensive comparative studies across countries. NGOs started getting much more active. There were a lot of civil society coalitions and networks that galvanized around certain rights. There was increased judicialization, so more judicial proceedings over the right to health, using this optional protocol where groups or people could actually complain to the UN Commissioner for Human Rights if they felt their right to health was being violated. And a watershed moment, which Chapman covers in some detail, was HIV/AIDS. I worked on HIV/AIDS for 10 years, and HIV/AIDS was more than, especially in the 1990s, it was more than a disease or a virus. It was an identity that people had. And around that identity, a very strong belief in the rights of HIV/AIDS people to preventive services, to drugs, to a number of issues, and grew and really deepened the understanding and commitment to the right of health, to the right to health across a number of sectors. Another question is, are states bound by their obligations in the ICSCR? States have a number of obligations. First of all, they have an obligation. There are three very key obligations are the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights in the ICSCR. So respect, refrain from interfering with these rights. Protect means to prohibit the interference of others for these rights. And to fulfill means to actively implement the requirements of the covenant. Chapman details on pages 52 and 53 of her book what the core obligations of the covenant are, and they are detailed specifically in the general comment 14, and it's these core obligations go way beyond Article 12 of the covenant, but these are the obligations that states are required to fulfill. There's also a number of obligations of the international community towards the covenant. These are obviously a bit harder to maintain or to insist and to monitor whether or not they're fulfilled. But there is explicitly recognized in the covenant a progressive realization principle. And this says that not every state will be able to fulfill the rights, the economic, social, and cultural rights enshrined in the covenant to the same degree at the same time. And for some states, because of the lack of availability of resources, it will take longer to fulfill these rights. It doesn't absolve states of fulfilling them, but it just recognizes that it could take some time. But it also calls upon states to seek assistance if they do not have enough resources to fulfill these rights, and it calls on international donors to support states in doing this. So how do you evaluate the right to health? There are 4 criteria set out in the General Comment 14. 1, are goods and services related to health present in sufficient quantities in a country? 2, are these goods or services accessible? And accessible means information accessibility. Do people know that they have these rights? Secondly, or that they have a right to goods and services. Secondly, can they physically access these goods and services? And thirdly, can they afford these goods and services if they can access them? So it doesn't say that all goods and services have to be free, but it does say that they have to be affordable. The third criteria is acceptability. Are goods and services culturally appropriate and respectful of ethical standards? And fourth is quality. Are goods and services scientifically appropriate and of good quality? So these 4 criteria are used to assess whether states are fulfilling the requirements of the right to health under the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now, of course, these are subjective, but there has been an enormous amount of work to try to figure out how can you judge these, and states are required to submit periodic reports on their progress in fulfilling these rights. So these are the 10 points I wanted to get across. There's also the article from Yuval Noah Harari. Some of you may know him, that I've asked you to comment on for this week, and try to get some of these issues, reflect on these issues as you think about what Harari says about the current COVID crisis and the challenges that that's throwing up to human rights in general and to the right to health.